I am so excited to be able to share my knowledge with you this morning, and I am one of the committee members that contributed to bringing this event to life. And as I was driving here this morning, I was reflecting about how far we've come. It's been a conversation we've been having for almost 2.5 years. I've had the pleasure of working with a few organizations in the Heartland, and so there was this conversation about how can we do this work of equity, diversity, and inclusion through community. So I couldn't be more excited to see all of your faces here, the opportunity not just only to listen to me, but to our other speakers. And so let's get going. Let me share about my work in creating a more inclusive world, one conversation at a time. So in my space, certainly there's a big body of work in and around truth and reconciliation. So thank you to Amber for saying our land acknowledgement this morning. And for me, my work in truth and reconciliation really comes in through knowledge building. So I spend a lot of time reading, and I always give the caveat that it may not be through a physical book, it may be an audible as I'm driving around and taking my kids to sporting activities, but there are always opportunities for us to grow in our knowledge. So when I think about acknowledging the land, it really is about seeking new knowledge, being conscious to learn and unlearn some of the past things that we have been taught in our lifetime, and knowing that the journey is more powerful when we share our truths. So yeah, you can absolutely take a picture of this, and actually a couple of the door prizes are some books by Indigenous authors as well. So again, encourage you to do the pre and post survey. So during my time with you this morning, I really want us to think about how we as individuals can contribute to building a more inclusive world. I've spent over 10 years really thinking about and understanding how to create change, and for me, the one thing that's always within our control is how we show up in our interactions and how we have conversations, not only with those that we work with, but with those in our family, within our community. And so when we can hone in on our individual contribution to creating a more inclusive world, I think those little ripple effects start to create even more change. Once we get grounded in some of that self-awareness, we can start to think about how can we create those inclusive environments? How can we be intentional about really thinking about our day-to-day work and how our actions are impacting others, the teams that we work with, the folks that are in our communities. And then we'll end on thinking about what are some of these, what am I going to do next? You know, I hope to leave you with a few nuggets to think about, to ponder, but also to take action. And so we'll end on what more can we do to create a more inclusive world. So grounding us in this conversation is the importance of diverse teams. And why does that matter? What do we mean when we say diversity? It is a term that when I started doing this work was pretty foreign. I didn't hear it a lot. Now we hear it a lot, and maybe it almost becomes a bit polarizing in certain circumstances. So I find if we can have a common language to use within this community and beyond, then we can actually dive into the real actions that matter. So it's important to recognize that each of us comes from a unique set of experiences and identities. These differences shape how we see the world, how we communicate with one another, and how we connect to one another. Being conscious of these differences is essential to fostering inclusive and respectful spaces. Our experiences are going to ground us and connect us, both personally and professionally. They give us a sense of who we are and how we move through the world. By sharing our experiences, we create a bridge that allows others to understand us more deeply, and even if their experiences are different than our own. As we think about this, there are varying degrees of visibility in terms of what someone's identity is. It's not always visible to know if someone has challenges in their day-to-day. And so there is so much that we need to realize comes below the surface. Each person's experience, cultural background, or identity can be visible or invisible in different contexts as well. So the challenge for us is not always obvious to understand who someone is or what their experiences have been. This is why it's so critical to approach each person with an open mind around curiosity rather than making assumptions. When we live in a super busy world, when we have lots of information coming to us, our biases can start to show up in terms of how we think about someone we might not know, or maybe not allowing us the time to really connect and experience someone's unique identity. So all of this to say there is more work to do for us in getting to know and understand the people that we work with, the individuals that are in our communities. A big part of the conversation in diversity inclusion is also around what we as practitioners talk and refer to as the business case. When I started in my career, it really was about, okay, what's the data telling us? Why should we pay attention to this? And so over the past 10 years and beyond, there's been a lot of research that's been done and shows that when we pay attention to the diversity within our teams, when we work and think about how to create inclusive environments, we actually get better results. So research has consistently shown that diverse teams are significantly more innovative and financially successful. In a McKinsey study, it revealed that companies with diverse leadership are 6 more times more innovative and 2 times more likely to exceed their financial goals. But the benefits of diversity go beyond innovation and financial performance. When employees feel that they belong, they are more engaged. This contributes to higher team performance and greater trust amongst colleagues. This trust then fosters collaboration, which in turn drives us to even more creative problem solving. So the data is clear. Diversity isn't just about feeling good, it's about the business imperative, and that we can actually have really effective and impactful organizations that are achieving the goals that they set out to achieve. So I want to also talk about this piece on innovation. Research shows that innovation is key to unlocking more effective team problem solving and higher levels of innovation. We start to see that diverse teams are not just better at generating creative and unlikely ideas, they're also better at making those ideas come to life. Diversity creates greater innovation because it invites different ways of thinking, problem solving, and decision making. In short, creating an inclusive environment means unlocking the full potential of diverse talent, leading to greater innovation, improved decision making, and ultimately better business results. Now, all of that said, what is diversity? When I use that word, what comes to mind for you? And I said earlier, we need to have this shared and common knowledge. And so this word gets used a lot, but it's important to understand the full scope of its meaning. Diversity refers to the presence of differences within a given setting. This could refer to differences in our race, our gender, our age, our sexual orientation, our religion, our socioeconomic status, our physical abilities, and much more. It encompasses the ways in which we are different from one another. But diversity is not just about counting those differences, it's about valuing those differences. When we embrace diversity in the workplace, we recognize that each person brings something unique to the table. And it's that unique perspective where innovation thrives. So I often say when I talk about diversity that we are all diverse, all of us in this space, based on where we grew up, who our parents, who our caregivers were, the schools that we attended, the jobs that we've held. There is diversity in that. The work that I do every single day has to do with the underrepresentation of certain dimensions of diversity inside of organizations. And so I want us to understand that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, it really is for all of us to understand our unique identities, that self-awareness, and through that, we can start to understand how can I use my uniqueness to help to support others in the workplace. So the one last piece here when we talk about how do we create better teams, how do we think about diversity inside our organizations, is understanding social identity. So these are identities and social constructs that we have created in society, and they're multifaceted. As you can look at the diagram up here, there are many different dimensions. Someone's socioeconomic background, is English their first language? What are their religious or spiritual beliefs? These elements shape how they see the world. It is their experience that brings them to today that shapes how they think about the problem that they might be thinking about in a work context. So when you think about the power of diversity, when you think about your own unique identity, I want you to also think about how diverse is your team? How does that diversity, or potentially lack of it, affect your decision making? Do you know those different dimensions of diversity for members of your team? Maybe there's more that you can do to connect, to understand, to better relate to those that are on your teams or even within your communities. So I'll leave you with this one idea as we think about diversity in teams. And this is a quote by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. There's a TED Talk, actually, so if you're really interested, you can Google it afterwards. But she talks about in this TED Talk the danger of a single story. The single story creates stereotypes. The problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. So as we think about those within our community, within our teams, do we know their stories? Do we know what's brought them to this place? Do we know those unique components of who they are? And if we don't, can we create the time to connect with them? So a big piece that acts as a bit of a barrier in this, and I've mentioned, is unconscious bias. And so when we are making those decisions in a workplace, within community, and when we have to pull in information, are we pulling in information from people that we already know? Are we relying on past information without pausing to think about what other information can we bring in? And so I want to talk to you a little bit about unconscious bias and how it can impact us on a day-to-day basis. How many of you have heard about unconscious bias before? So it has been something that has been talked about for the last number of years, but within unconscious bias, it's something that we can that we can eliminate, but we can interrupt. We can start to think about how do these unconscious biases, especially in our workplace or when we're working in community, how do they impact the work that we're doing? So since many hands went up, I won't spend too much time on this. But unconscious bias is the automatic, implicit attitudes or stereotypes that influence judgments and behaviors towards individuals or groups. And this is happening behind the scenes. It is happening unconsciously. But the part for us to start to think about is that unconscious bias impacts decisions in areas such as hiring, promotion, interaction, leading to potentially unintentional discrimination or unequal treatment. Recognizing and addressing unconscious bias is essential for fostering diversity and inclusion within organizations and society. So what gets in our way? We are built on a lifetime of experiences and a mental model that's built around cultural conditioning. Again, those pieces of where we were born, who our parents or caregivers were, the schools that we attended, all of that starts to create this mental model of how we see the world. It's the lens in which we see the world through. We're going to feel more comfortable with those that reflect our own values. We think about the world around us right now and we see a divide starting to happen in terms of values, or as I like to put it, a perception of what those values are. And I challenge us to start to think about, is there opportunities for us to, rather than seeing those differences as negatives, is there ways for us to come together? How can we start to build bridges across those perceived differences? What else gets in our way is we're more likely to support or believe someone within our own social group rather than an outsider. Who are we putting on the inside closest to us? Who are we potentially putting on the outside? We tend to search for information in ways that confirms our prior beliefs. This happens a lot within social media, where we start to follow people who have the same beliefs as us, and really creates a bit of an echo chamber in terms of supporting our thoughts, rather than maybe thinking about what else is there that I need to know, what else exists outside of that wall I maybe have built up. So we can rely sometimes too much on pre-existing information rather than seeking different perspectives than our own. So again, lots of hands went up, but I want you to know that at any given moment in time, our brains are bombarded with 11 million pieces of information. So this includes what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we touch, and out of all of that, we only process a tiny fraction, about 40 to 50 pieces of information. Now, within this, scholars have found that there are certain contexts or circumstances in which biases are most likely to manifest themselves. So this is the part that I want you to remember. They're going to show up in moments of intense time pressures. They're going to be showing up when we have elevated cognitive busyness, and when we have to make decisions that are made in contexts of high ambiguity. So how many of us have deadlines that we have to achieve? How many of us are going through not just what's in our workday, but that list that we have to do when we get home? If I'm a parent, so I'm constantly thinking about my kids' lists as well. And we don't always have full information to make our decision. So I think for me, the potential for this unconscious bias is showing up all the time. And so it's bringing it into our self-awareness. When we're making decisions that impact others, how can we start to reflect and pause and think about, how can I make sure I'm bringing in the necessary information to make the best and informed decision? There are many types of biases that can show up, and there are harmful impacts around this. When we think about stereotypes, we think about that they are not only harmful because they misrepresent individuals, but they also limit the opportunities available to those individuals. So we have this opportunity to see beyond these stereotypes, because if we don't, we're limiting individuals' potentials. We're potentially creating division based on those stereotypes. We're reinforcing bias that we maybe have been taught over time, and we stifle that innovation. So think about a recent decision that you have had to make. Can you identify that if there was any biases that may have influenced that decision? And so again, this is not an opportunity to place shame or blame that we have these unconscious biases. It's about building up our self-awareness and understanding how can we do better. I want to share a little case study with you. It's around facial recognition bias. And so facial recognition is becoming more common. This is a few years old, but in 2020 is the case study, and there were serious issues with bias that emerged, specifically affecting people of color. In 2020, a black man was wrongfully arrested in the US due to a facial recognition error. The match was incorrect, and the case drew significant attention to the problem of bias algorithms. Many facial recognition systems are trained on data that is not diverse. Without adequate representation of different facial backgrounds in the data, algorithms struggle with accurate identification, specifically with minority groups. So what were the consequences? The Detroit case is just one example of this, but it highlights the danger of bias within technology. When misidentifications happen, this can lead to wrongful arrests or other discriminatory actions. And so this case demonstrates the importance of developing systems with fairness in mind. If we rely on the way that we've always done things, if we rely on only bringing in certain pieces of data, then we are going to get similar outcomes. And so this is where the power of pausing. How do we have diversity in our teams so we acknowledge and understand that we need to have a more diverse set of data points in the case of this example? And so even as our world continues to change and shift, and AI becomes an integrated part of our day-to-day, this is something for us to think about. For me personally, I do use different AI technologies in my example is always, sort of maybe not a silly one, but I ask AI, tell me a quote, 10 quotes of leadership. And then it sort of spits out these 10 quotes, and I read through them. And my bias is very high around making sure that women reach their highest potential. It's where I started my career, and you can ask me about that when we are on break. But when I ask, tell me these 10 leadership quotes, they go, here are 10 leadership quotes from men. And so I go back in AI, I'm like, no, try again. I want to hear some leadership quotes from women. And so that for me is this opportunity to reprogram what the default is. And so we can all start to think about how can we reprogram that default. So as we think about recognizing and combating bias, like I said, there's many variations of this, and some of those are affinity bias and the tendency for us to gravitate towards people who are similar to ourselves, confirmation bias and seeking out and favoring information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. If you were to Google, look up, even ask AI, they would be able to give you this really long list, but know that these come up quite often within the workplace dynamic. So how can we start to address unconscious bias in real time? Slow down, check our assumptions, build new knowledge. How can we bring in new information that maybe counters some of the information that we have previously received? Pause for thought. Give yourself room to think and ensure your questions are open-ended. My favorite question when I'm kind of not quite getting it, tell me more. Help me understand. Let me hear your perspective, because then I can start to understand and we can connect across that perceived difference. And solicit input. We don't have to do this alone. We can gain this knowledge through those that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. So addressing these roadblocks is going to become a part of our work. I fear quite often this divide that I see every single day, and if we don't start to enable and use some of these tools to address these roadblocks, I think that divide will continue to widen. So I said that we would spend a bit of time talking about the tools. So I'm going to close out with some tools that you can start to think about. How can I implement these in my day-to-day basis? And how can I start to bridge this gap between good intentions? You're all here because you have good intentions. You want to learn, you want to grow, you want to bring in new knowledge. But how can you bring some of these tools I'm about to share with you and bring them into your day-to-day to start to move us towards that inclusive outcome? So the awkward Yeti here tells, the heart is telling the brain, stop trying to control everything. And I do think this is part of our work. How are we connecting to the human part of who we are? As we hear the conversation again around technology, around AI, is it going to take over our jobs? Is it going to change the dynamics of the world that we live in? Well, it's going to change things for sure, but the piece that will never hold is the human element, the heart side of what makes us uniquely us. And so sometimes we've got to give way to embracing that part of us. And it's a big component of how I think about the work that I do and leading from that place of heart. So here's tool number one. I talked about unconscious bias really quickly, but you can start to think about which system am I operating from. This work, Thinking Fast and Slow, is by Nobel Prize winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman. And he talks about system one thinking is a near instantaneous process. It happens automatically, intuitively, and with little effort. It's driven by instinct and our experiences. But system two also exists, and it's the slower system and requires more effort. It is conscious and logical. So when you're making decisions, again, that impact others, think about, am I operating in system one, that quick, fast pace, well, we'll do it this way because we've always done it this way? Or can we slow down? Can we pause and switch into system two and bring in some additional information? Because we know when we're operating in system two, it's more reliable for complex decisions. So I encourage you to think about which system you might be operating from. Connecting across difference. So again, back to this idea of how can we, it may perceive difference to someone on our team, in our organization, within community, but how can we start to actively listen to their ideas, their thoughts? How can we seek clarity before assuming what they are going to tell us or what we think they want the outcome to be? How can we also start to think about empathy and putting ourselves in someone else's shoes? Remember, they have all of this lived experience that's bringing them to this point in time for them to share what their ideas are, where they want to take the project, where they want to take these ideas. And so if we can start to build our empathy, there's a lot of research on empathy, one of which is that it's an organizational superpower when we can start to practice empathy. But the other thing is that we can actually grow in our empathy. It is something that we can learn. It's something that we can work on. It's not something that we're born with or not born with. So acknowledge and validate others' experiences and start to think about how they might be different from your own. And honestly, when we really think about it, we probably do have many different experiences that we are bringing into the space that we occupy. And so if we can take the time to hear and acknowledge other people's experiences, it's going to get us closer to that place of inclusion. Separate intent from impact. I'm going to dive into this one a little bit more on the next slide because I think it's so important. A big part of this work is that we aren't always going to get it right. We're going to mess it up. But when we do, it's how we respond from that moment that really is character building and whether or not we're moving towards that inclusive outcome. And lastly here, when we're connecting across difference, it's so important for us to take time to identify the learning opportunity. As we think about that learning opportunity, ask yourself, what can I learn from this situation? How can I improve my understanding or my behavior moving forward? It's about staying open, acknowledging areas of growth, and striving to better interact with one another. So intent versus impact. Let's break this down a little bit. Intent is what we mean to communicate. It's internal. It reflects our process, our thought process, our motivation, and the desired outcomes we envision when we speak or act. Impact is how our message or behavior is received by others. It's external. It's shaped by the listener's context, their experiences, cultural background, and perceptions. And so I share this one because I hear a lot of people say, well, I better not say anything at all for fear of retribution, for fear of getting it wrong, for saying the wrong thing. And so while we can't control the actions of others, we can start to use the language of, I didn't intend to do that. I'm sorry that it had that impact. Let's unpack it. Let's have that conversation. Because without that, then we're going to continue to see this divide and putting people into different categories. And so I really want you to think about this in your day today. I know that everyone intends to have positive impact, but sometimes we don't have that full information and we may have a negative impact on someone else. And so that is the learning opportunity. How do we move forward from that? And it's through conversation, and it's through understanding that we can start to acknowledge, I now see and understand why someone may have interpreted that negatively. I'm going to do better next time. Because I don't have all day with you, I can't spend a bunch of time on this, but I want to leave you with something called the heart model. And this has got some elements of things that I've already talked to you about, but it is building off these ideas of humility. Humility is about recognizing that we don't know everything and being open to learning from others. It's about taking responsibility for mistakes and seeing them as opportunities to grow, both personally and as a team. When we approach each other with humility, we create a safe space where different perspectives can be shared openly. I just talked about the empathy component, but this is about understanding someone else's feelings, experiences, perspectives, the time it takes to hear their feelings, their experiences, their perspectives. In a diverse workplace, empathy shows us and allows us to build deeper connections and allows us a space where everyone feels valued and heard. It's key to building trust and collaboration. If we don't have that, it's going to make it a lot harder for us to come together to collaborate. Authenticity, the A in heart, is being true to ourselves and transparent in our actions and our communications. It's about showing up as our full self and encouraging others to do the same. Remember, we are all unique individuals. Authenticity fosters trust and creates strong, genuine relationships within teams. Resiliency is about the ability to bounce back from challenges and setbacks. It's about adapting to change and learning from difficult experiences. Resiliency not only shapes us as individuals, but also strengthens teams as we learn to navigate obstacles together and grow from them. And then the T from heart comes from curiosity. And this is where we have a desire to explore new ideas. So heart is more about understanding all of these pieces and integrating them into a way that we lead, we communicate, and collaborate. So I have 2 more slides. The other piece that I want you to think about, again, as we build these building blocks and we start to think about our own level of self-awareness. How am I showing up? How am I maybe leading with humility? How am I maybe needing to spend some more time in curiosity? We can also do this in community. And I want you to think about who are you spending time with? Who are your allies in growth? Who are your greatest teachers? When you think about, at the end of the day, if you go home and you turn on the TV, if you're watching something on Netflix or you're choosing whatever channel, do you pause and think, maybe there's an opportunity for me to choose a different show, a different channel, learn from someone different today? Who am I sitting next to when I come to this conference? Is there this opportunity for me to connect with someone new? It feels more comfortable to sit with those that we know, but there's opportunities for us to connect, and you never know where that connection might take you. So I'll leave you with this: your role in conscious inclusion. Reflect on practices encouraging you to think about how you can personally contribute to creating an inclusive environment. Reflect on your biases, your practices, and how your actions impact the team. Think about setting the stage, inviting participation in these conversations around inclusion, and how are you going to respond productively? As leaders and individuals in fostering open and respectful places and spaces, we all have a role to play. And I want you to think about a commitment to recalibration. And what I mean by that is we're not always going to get it right. So in that moment, how do we learn? How do we take in that new information? And how do we continue to move forward? I can't give you the 10 steps. Do these 10 things and then you will be an inclusive leader. It is about your individual actions every single day and continuing to learn and to continue to grow and evolve. So I will close by sharing this question with you for you to reflect on. We have some time together today, so maybe you do turn to the person you're sitting next to, and maybe over lunch this becomes your conversation. But reflect on one action you can take, whether it's about challenging bias, practicing conscious inclusion, creating space for others, or prioritizing rest and reflection. Small, consistent actions lead to big, transformative changes. Thank you.